As Terry mentioned, I was the chair from 2022 to 2025, and my name's Andy Lowes, and I now work for Watertrust Australia. I do just want to acknowledge country that we're on today and pay respect to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. I'm going to talk about the Snowy Water Inquiry Outcomes Implementation Deed, and this is it here. So this is it. This is about 70 pages long. And my first slide is just a bit about the background about where this came from and why it's been reviewed. So after the Second World War and between sort of the 1940s and 70s, we had the building of the Snowy Hydro Scheme. And as part of that, Tantangara Dam went in about 1960. Now, not surprisingly, massive hydropower project did exactly what it needed to do, capture water and use it for other purposes, hydropower and irrigation. Impacts were seen in the 80s and 90s that led to the Snowy Water Inquiry, which explains the first half of why this document is titled the way it is titled. So those concerns in the Snowy Water Inquiry tried to tackle that and return some water back to the rivers. And so that culminated in this deed, which is an intergovernmental agreement between New South Wales, Victoria and the Commonwealth to try and return some environmental flows back to these rivers that have been impacted. At the time, probably seen as a real world leading document. You know, it's returning environmental flows back to rivers impacted by hydropower. But it hasn't probably aged well, is a fair comment, and especially in regard to the Upper Murrumbidgee River. Its intent was to try and return 21% of the Snowy's original flows, and incorrectly, it states that it was trying to return 30% of the Upper Murrumbidgee's flows. And it hasn't. It's landed at 10% at best, 7 to 8% in most years, and as low as 1% in really dry years. Since 2002, we've had the two droughts, Millennium Drought 17 to 19 drought. We've had the river dry up. We've had community pressure come in from groups like, almost every group represented in this room, including UMCN, the Australian River Restoration Centre, and a whole range of others, both the universities in Canberra, etc. The ACT Senator David Pocock pushed for a review of this in 2023. The second ACT Senator Gallagher announced the review in February 2025, and it started in October last year. It is moving quick. The intention of this review, which started in October, is to deliver recommendations by June. So it's moving quite quickly. The review is focused on this upper part of the Upper Murrumbidgee River here. The terms of reference really clearly highlight that this is a key focus of the review. But to look at how you change flows, and sorry, this is the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, a map. I've got some hard copies over there if people want it, because it gives a really good zoom in on the power scheme. If you're changing flows in this part of the river, we need to look at least how it impacts the Snowy Hydro footprint that it interacts with. So what does it mean for power generation? And predominantly, most of the flows go down the Tumut River to support these irrigation districts out in the western part of New South Wales. So how does changing flows and sending them down this way impact the water that's available here? So that we're trying to understand, if we change these flows, what does it mean for other stakeholders and values? And this is a really tricky modelling job, and I'll come back to the modelling later, because we need to understand hydrology, we need to understand energy and economics, and we need to understand downstream water allocation systems. So I'll pop my SWIOID down. Thank you. The governance of this review is quite different. And when Terry said Watertrust is looking at trying to get better processes in water management, this isn't perfect, but it's better. The deed parties up here, New South Wales, ACT, Commonwealth. Really importantly, independent review panel. A panel that is independent from government looking at this. And I'll introduce them in a sec. We have a government group. And the difference this government group brings is it has the ACT government in it. The deed doesn't at the moment. So that's the significance of that group. We have a First Nations advisory group. We have a stakeholder advisory group, which is the process that we're running at Watertrust. And then we have the public consultation process, which has just completed the first round. And I think they had at least 120 to 130 submissions as part of that. So it's a massive response from community and stakeholders. We have a technical team as well, supporting all the modelling and information that needs to sit behind this. Now, I guess normal run-of-the-mill engagement in water management, you sort of cut this whole section out. There's no independent panel. There's no specific groups to target engagement. It's governments putting out a position and then a have your say process. So people throw here's what we think in, nobody gets to learn from each other, nobody gets to quite understand the decision space that's being discussed. I'm going to introduce you now just to the panel and then this stakeholder advisory group. So just quickly, the panel, it's chaired by Dr. Wendy Craig, used to be head of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, used to be head of the Productivity Commission, has done a lot of work on decision making around flows in the Great Barrier Reef, and I'm sure I've only covered 1% of her CV. And two other experts as well on there, covering energy, water, and hydroelectricity, and broader electricity economics. So a really high-powered, independent panel is critical to this process, and it's really important. To balance these interests and understand the values of this part of the world and the impacts in those other parts of the Southern Basin, we've got 4 irrigator stakeholders from downstream in the Murrumbidgee irrigation and Colliambly area. We've got our environmental and community groups, which brings in UMCN, Tuggeranong Community Council, and thanks Glennis, I should point out we've got 3 members in this stakeholder advisory group in the room today. So we've got Terry as UMCN, we've got Antia as Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach, and Glennis from Tuggeranong Community Council, as well as Shuann Lovett from the Australian River Restoration Centre, who's done a lot of work, with the Forgotten River website to push for these changes. We've got catchment management groups, we've got local government, we've got Queanbeyan and Snowy Monero councils on there, looking at and Icon Water, looking at that sort of regional water security for the region. We have some hydrology and freshwater ecology expertise and snowy hydro as well. So now this process has already churned out some really key documents that I'm sure you've seen already, but I've hyperlinked them in here and I'll send the slides around after. The review framework of how this is being undertaken has some key principles in it that are worth going back to as we go through this process. In terms of reference, I've got a couple of pages printouts here for folks who want that. Primarily focused on the Upper Murrumbidgee, but was expanded to include the Snowy River as well in October last year. Not for additional flows necessarily, but to understand how can they change the use of that water in that catchment? What have we learned over the last 23 years to do that? Reviews issues analysis. That's a great document. I'll show some key graphs out of that. That's worth going back to, and that covers broader than just ecology, regional water security, and a range of other values. Independent review panels issues consultation report, and that didn't mince any words about the state of the Upper Murrumbidgee, and that's what's just gone out through the have your say process, and that had about 20 to 30 questions in it. So I think keep coming back to the review framework, the issues analysis, and the independent panels reports, because they're really handy documents to have. We've got several gauges on the Upper Murrumbidgee River, and this is, while we can model flows at each of them, we're looking at 3 key ones in particular. We're looking at how much water needs to be released from Tantangra Dam itself, right at the start of downstream Tantangra, to understand how additional flows can repair this part of the river. The second gauge the review is focusing on is Middegang Crossing, with a key focus on importance for Macquarie perch. It's also, in terms of critical water security, as Antia mentioned, it's Coomer's primary offtake. The third gauge, which we're talking a lot about, is Lobbs Hole, which is just downstream of Angle Crossing. And the Lobbs Hole gauge is important because that's the stretch that gives us an indication of what's coming into the ACT. And also it's the stream gauge upstream of Tharwa, where the river ran dry. So it gives us a really good snapshot of what does the river need to make that connectivity from up here through into the ACT, where you then start to get those tributaries come in and the river starts to gain flows again. Now, I mentioned a couple of graphs in the issues paper that can help frame the conversation if you are chatting to folks about it. This first one, which was developed by the Upper Murrumbidgee Catchment Network initially, shows this step change that resulted from Tantangra Dam being built in the 1960s, this reduction in flows that are then set from thereafter. I'll go to the next graph. So this is now the SWIOID. What was it targeting and how's it being met? And this one down the bottom, what was it targeting for the Murrumbidgee and how is it being met? And you can see these dry years, 2018 to 2021. It gets right down This is gigalitres a day. We're in that sort of 4 to 5 to 6 gigalitres, which is not much for the river. You see it tick up here above the target, which is those wet years we had 2020 to 2023-4. This also included some water taken from the Goodra-Digby to help boost this up. So it's not a bad short-term stopgap, but not something we want to be doing, taking from one river to give to another. So it's an important graphic just to show how the flows have tracked to date. This third one is the energy picture and the revenue that comes from energy. Total electricity generation earnings, total dividends to shareholders, which is the two ministers, Minister for Energy and Minister for Finance, how much the current release impacts these, and then a hypothetical, if you went to 81 gigalitres, currently 27, if you went to 81, that's the potential impact, just to show the scale of early shaping of what these flows could mean for energy generation. But there's modelling looking at refining this, but this is a really handy graph in that issues analysis, just to, when people say, oh, we're going to lose, are we going to switch off the energy for the eastern states of Australia? Probably not. Absolutely not. But anyway, it's an important part of the picture because this is where the big trade-off lies, energy and water for the Murrumbidgee. Now we are looking at how do we do decision-making better in Australia, and this is what Watertrust is looking at. And I think when I showed you the governance diagram before, it showed how it's kind of a have your say process and that's it, but often with a predetermined set outcome. We're using a method called structured decision-making, which we're working with a group from British Columbia in Canada, who've been doing this for 20 years to try and balance hydropower, among other values, with salmon fisheries, two massive industries probably needing almost opposite water requirements. The idea of this, and the reason why it's different from the have your say process, stakeholders get to sit and receive all the information at the same time. Stakeholders with different values get to sit in the same room and learn from each other. What are their pressures and what would they like to see in a solution? It's transparent and it allows the group to work together to try and identify solutions that might not have been identified previously. So this group we're working with from British Columbia, they had to do this in 24 catchments. They reached consensus decision in 23 of those catchments. And everyone always asks then, what happened in the 24th catchment? And the group came to the decision they didn't have enough information to get that final agreement. So they documented it, went away, got the information they needed, and then reached a consensus view. What was different is that the management solutions that came out of that process were not ones that people had identified at the start. And that's the beauty, I think, of having stakeholders work together to find solutions. It's pretty simple. You set your decision context, you set your objectives based on your values, you understand how you're going to measure performance, so how you're going to measure the impact to energy or ecology or regional water security. You identify what are the possible management options, what are the alternatives we can work through, what are the trade-offs, and that's the big one in this one. Chatting to you, Tom, at the start, it's what are the trade-offs about a finite resource? Implement, monitor and learn. And so this process does have iterations where you come back during and say, we've put something up, was it right? No, let's come back and look at it again. Decision context, that's my next slide. So the decision context in this, for me, it's pretty straightforward from the hydrological sense. This is the modelled natural flow average for the Upper Murrumbidgee. So this assumes no regulation, no Tantangara Dam. Well, how would the system, how would we expect it to run naturally? Probably representing on average about 300 gigalitres a year, or 9 to 10 Lake Burley Griffins, if that helps. This black line down the bottom is current conditions. So around that 27 gigalitres, so that 10% threshold. The review, the documentation that's come out is saying this option is no longer suitable. We can't continue with current conditions. This is the decision space we're working in. Modelled natural, not an option. Current conditions, not an option. So the group is stepping through what happens when you have different flow options in this envelope here, and how does it then interact with energy production and irrigation, and amongst other values. The first step is trying to identify a flow regime that the river needs now. And So say 330 roughly. Some of the flow rates we're looking at is about 80 gigs to give you an indication, which is kind of what was modelled in that energy one. So what does it need now? One of the flaws of the SWIOID is it's had no review point to date. So another recommendation is make sure this can be reviewed to build in the climate projections. On the critical human water needs, yes, like the councils and Icon Water have done that about regional water security. It's in our mind for the ecology side as well, but I think the first step is getting the current amount is just not enough. So what do we need in the short term, and then how do we build this so that it can actually respond to new information as climate change impacts emerge? So we're supporting the stakeholder advisory group to engage with their networks. Not everyone is represented in that room, and upstream irrigators is one example of that. So we have these opportunities like coming and speaking here today, or going out on properties and chatting to people who are affected, or have values along the river. So these are our kitchen table conversations at Tharwa and also up around Drumore, up near Cooma. I mentioned the Snowy, so this work has also taken us onto the Snowy River, where we went and met stakeholders at Dalgety and also down at Marlow in Victoria, and a really strong response. There was people there from the original Snowy inquiry who were keen to see, after 23 years, some of the things they've learned that can build in to help the Murrumbidgee, but what can we learn to help them as well? I mentioned the timelines. I think that's my next one. This structured decision-making process, the folks from North America would normally run something like this over 18 months to 2 years. We started at 5 months. So it's a supercharged process, and that technical team that I flagged before are just feeding information into the stakeholder advisory group. And a challenge we have is packaging that up in a way that people can understand. The review panel, with all their experience, said this is one of the most complex issues they've come across in trying to balance these needs in water management, energy management, irrigation. So these were our initial timeframes. 3 workshops, a couple of rounds of modelling, with recommendations by March, April. I might get you to click through. We added the Snowy River forums there in early Feb, and jump again. The modelling is the highest risk on this. So we need the modelling to understand the impacts, but the modelling that we're doing and we're asking technical groups to do, they said they've never done this much modelling for this type of question in this amount of time. So it is the highest risk of the process, and it is impacting these timeframes. I think I've only got 2 more slides. And because of this, our initial 3rd workshop, we now have a 4th workshop that we're working with the stakeholder advisory group in April, and recommendations are now looking at April, May, June. Like, it's getting a bit more rubbery, but not by much. I'll jump to my last slide, which is the next steps. I mentioned the Have Your Say had closed already. We have our upcoming stakeholder advisory group meetings, and I encourage you to connect with the stakeholder advisory group members in the room to feed things into the process. Terry alluded to this, but the independent review panel is going to release a kind of secondary consultation of what they've heard report in April to May. And this is a really key point for the group to watch out, to see how those 120, 130 submissions have come into the process, and is it reflecting the issues that people are raising. Initially end of June for recommendations, and the time frame for that is legislative reviews that are happening after that. But we are hearing language, it is now expanding into July and August, just because the modelling hasn't been able to keep up with the process. So thank you all, that's the end of the formal presentation. But I do encourage you to connect with the stakeholder advisory group members and get in touch if needed. Thanks.